and welcome to the second session of the fifth week of the Angular development course. In the previous session, we just tried to understand on a high level of what is the use of a service and what is dependency injection. So let's further continue on that and try to understand it in more detail. Before we proceed any further, we need to first understand a few concepts so that it's really ingrained in your mind on what is it that we are trying to achieve. So the first thing which you would have observed is we have something called a component. And a component is nothing but, as we said, it is an HTML plus your TypeScript file, or you can call it your directive logic, which helps you to kind of implement a particular view on your screen. So anything, as I said, whatever you want to show your user on the browser, you have to implement it using the component. Okay, so component are purely more from a presentational perspective. And I also said to you guys that component will internally depend on other data or other functionality which might be common across different components. So say for example, I have a component which has a login page. I have a component which is I'm allowing the user to search for any product. I could have a component which could be a cart, shows me the items added in the cart. I could have a component which is doing the checkout, and again I could have a component which shows me acknowledgement and allows the user to go back, right? So internally, if you see for all these components, might be a few things which are common. So what are the common things? So one thing is all of them could be making API calls. All of them could be holding some shared state variables or state values. So what I mean by state value is the current application, few values of the current application state. So say for example, they could be holding what is the current user who has logged in, what is the cart items which is added, what are the if you have some location specific offers or something, you could also have what is the current location where the user is logged in, so on and so forth, right? So there could be some of these shared data which is required by all these components as well. And also there could be some other utilities as well. So you could have a few functions which is common across all the components. So say for example, all the components might have a functionality which might check if the user has logged in or not. So maybe assume you have a function say is logged in, which is kind of validating it every time the user gets into every component. And say assume you have implemented a security where if the user is not logged in, you don't show him or her that page. So even those kind of logic, if you see, is kind of constant across all the components, or maybe slightly modified based on the exact requirement, but fairly the code is quite common across all the components. So in a classic sense, what we do, either we can write each and every of these method into each and every of these component file and kind of use it, but that is not the standard way to do it, because you should not be repeating your code too many often. That's not a good way to do it, right? So what is the other way option? So that is where the services come into picture. So what is services is, so services are nothing but essentially you could say they just provide you a method or a way to write reusable functions and also share some state variables or variables across your application components, and they can be instantiated once. They are more or less a singleton class, meaning they just get instantiated once and they can be used across all your components, wherein the data or the store will not change. The same variable or the same value would be kind of propagating to all the components. Any component can read data from it and any component can write back data to it, and if there is any change to this data, this will again get propagated to all the components. So that is the concept of dependency injection. Okay, so now I hope you guys are really clear on what is service, because that is the crux of this week. So again, to summarize, services are nothing but you could say they are just a common, you could say they are a class which implements some common functionalities, utilities and variables which might be required by your application, and they are instantiated only once. And to implement service, Angular uses something called as dependency injection, which we just saw in the previous session, wherein what we mean by dependency injection is, so say assume you have a service over here and you have a component over here. In order for this service to talk with this component, we need something in between, a middleman, which is nothing but the injector. So what the injector does is, it will just kind of take in the implementation of the service and provide it to the component, right? So that's how the injector works, and that's the concept of dependency injection as well. And since it is using dependency injection, the service will only be instantiated once and the same copy would be available to all the component. Why am I repeating this instantiated once many times? Because it's very important for you to understand, if I have say theoretically, if I have multiple copies of the same service, so say for example, my component 1 is using one instance of service, component 2 is using another instance of the same service. Okay, so in this case, what happens is each instance of the service is different. They would be internally having different values. So there could be scenarios where my component 2 could be updating some variable of S2 instance which might not be part of the S1 in the component 1. You're getting my point. What I'm trying to say is if you have multiple instances, then the data will not get shared across the component because each might again hold its own private data. So just to avoid that, we have this concept of singleton class wherein we just kind of instantiate it once and we allow the data to be shared across multiple components, right? And it's not just about the variable, even your functions and any utilities that you write will be just instantiated one and it will be available across to all your components. So that is the component concept of services and dependency injection. So now since we have understood this theory, let's try to get it into action. So what we will do is we will just go back to the same project which we created earlier, the demo app, and we'll just add the service to it and try to see how it helps us to create reusable classes, like reusable utilities, and have some common variables, and also we'll try to understand how it is instantiated and used across various components. So once we are done with this 2 sessions or this 2 weeks, we will be getting over with this demo app and we'll be also creating a real world application. So before we get into building a real world application, I want you guys to focus on the core concepts. So that is the reason we are first trying all these things in the demo app. So going back to the demo app, so I just commented out whatever we did till yesterday, like in the previous session. And today what we are going to do is we'll be taking a hypothetical scenario and creating a services to implement it. Okay, so say assume this is my hypothetical scenario. Going back to whiteboard, so say just assume this is my requirement of my application. Say I have my app component which I already have, and I also have my test component, right? Hypothetically, I want to kind of host a variable or share a variable between both of them. Maybe say I could give it a name, like the variable name as name, and I could pass it some values, so maybe like ABC. And similarly, I also want it to share a variable name called counter, and this initially could have the value of 0, and since it's a number, it can be incremented or decremented by any of these components. And also since we have other 2 components called lazy one, which is lazily loaded and part of other module, so let's assume that we also want all these 4 modules to have a common access to these 2 concepts, these 2 variables. So one is name and one is counter, and the other requirement is I also want them access to a common method. So say one of that could be get name, which will just return me the name which is currently stored in this particular common utility file or the service which we are writing. And also similarly I could have a function which could be called as say increment counter, which would take in the current value of this counter and increment it to 1 and send me the latest updated value. So say assume these are the 2 utilities which I need to implement. So on one side I have 2 variables which I need to share across all the 4 components. On the other side I need 2 utility methods which I need to kind of implement in all my components. So how can I do that? So to do this is where we can use the concept of services. And also from an interview perspective and also from your general knowledge perspective, always remember that whenever you have any component, right, your component should only be concerned with implementing whatever you see on the screen. Meaning like anything you want to do in terms of manipulating these elements or the data which would be used to show on the screen, only those things your component should be doing. But any common reusable functions or utilities or any state management work which you feel could be kind of offloaded away from the component, always ensure that you're using services for that, because since being it's a singleton, we could share the data across multiple components. And also we could write a bunch of services file which could be handling one particular feature or one particular part of your application. It's not necessary that your application will only have one service file. We could have multiple services file, and each service file could be dealing with one particular functionality. So say for example, I could have a service file which only purely deals with API calls. I could have a service file which purely deals only with the managing the state variables or state values. I could have one services which purely just handles which has utility functions. So maybe I could have a function which converts the kilobytes into megabytes, so on and so forth. And similarly, I could have a services which could like not do any third party things, like maybe send analytics related logging things to my backend, so on and so forth. So the way we'll also look at how we can divide our code once we get into developing a real world application in a few weeks from now. But for now, just understand that you can, just like the way you can have multiple components created, similarly you can also create multiple services in your project. Okay. So with that being said, and I hope now the requirement is clear. So what we are saying is, in my app component, in my test component, in my lazy one component, and my lazy two component, I want to share these variable names. One is name and one is counter. And similarly, I want to have two utilities file. One is get name and one is increment counter. So let's see how we can implement it using this concept of services. Okay. So coming back, so always, as I said earlier, whenever you're creating any new Angular components or files, always ensure if your Angular CLI is running, you have to kill it. So how to kill it is just give Control C. It will ask you to terminate, give yes, and that's it. You have killed your Angular server. Just clear the console. And now we have to create a services file, right? So as a best practice, what it is better that you first create a folder here called services, and then dump all your service related concepts in that. So if you remember the session from the second week, we said as a best practice, is better to organize your project in such a way that related items are under a single folder. So what I mean by that is, so if you take the current project structure, since we are just still playing around with the features, we have not really implemented it well. But if you see, lazy one deals with all the components and modules, which is part of lazy one module. Lazy two deals with all the components and modules, which is dealing with lazy two. And all the app related items are like the core root module and root components are part of the home directory. So this is how we have correctly structured our folder. So what we can do is, since we are now going to create a services, we are going to create services as part of this week, you can create one folder here called services, and as part of this services folder, we can create multiple services files, right, which can be then shared back to each of these components. So now let's see how we can do that. So to create any services, just the way you created Angular component by using ng generate component and component name. So similarly, for creating our services, you can use the same command, like a similar command, like ng generate. Instead of components, if we are going to create a service here, we are going to give it the name as service, and then the service name. Okay. So let's now create a service and see it in action. So what we will do is, we will type the word ng generate service. So if you notice carefully, whenever we have to create any new Angular file, be it a component, directive, pipe, service, or whatever, any other utility, so this part is common. We first give ng and then we say generate. Generate means you are creating something, and after that we mention what is the file or the utility which we are creating. So in our case, we are going to create a service, so that's why we are mentioning it as service. And after this, we have to give the name or the the name for a service. So one way is you can directly just give it a name of, say, I would just give it a name of, say, utility. Okay. And if I press enter, what happens is, inside my app folder, a service with the name of utility gets created. So I'll just show it for you. So I pressed enter, and now you can see that inside as part of my app component, we have this utility service.ts and utility spec created. So what is the spec.ts? As we discussed earlier, anything that ends with spec.ts means that it is the corresponding unit test cases for this particular services. Okay. So don't worry about the spec dot right now, because we have a dedicated session for that later at the end of this course. So we will be looking at writing unit test cases over there. So coming back to utility.services.ts, you will see that this is the basic code that gets created for you when you write any services. So let's try to understand what is that. So first you will see that you have something called import injectable from Angular core. So as I said, all these are nothing but your libraries or your utilities which are part of your core Angular core library, and you kind of import this injectable. If you remember from dependency injection concept we saw earlier, in order for your component to use a service, you need an injector, right? So this is what is providing that injector for you. And here what we are doing is under this injectable director, we are saying provided in root. So let's try to understand what it means. So we'll go back to the whiteboard. So when I say inside my services file under injectable provided in root, right? So what I'm trying to say is, if you remember, right, we say that this services will be only instantiated once and then shared across all the modules or components or other services file, right? So where this service get instantiated is what we are trying to say over here. So when I say provided in root, it means that a copy of this service would be created or hosted in your app module, and that would be available across your application. It can be in any other module like lazy 1, lazy 2, or it can be also be part of any other component which is part of your app module. Okay, if I don't give root over here, right, and I give say lazy 1, so what it means is the services would be instantiated as part of the lazy 1 module, and it will only be available inside the lazy 1 module. Okay, if it is not, and remember this key concept because it is important for you. If I say that my app is provided in root, it means that my service is available across my application in any of the lazy loaded module or any of the components. Okay, that is, it's like it becomes a kind of a global service. So remember this concept. So if I say provided in root, I mean that it is globally available. And if I just provide one particular module name over here, I mean to say it is kind of local to that specific module. So always remember that. So in this case, instead of say provided in, I give lazy 1 module name. So what happens is the service instance would be created in lazy 1 scope, and only any component which is part of the lazy 1 module would be able to access this services. Okay. So in most of the scenarios, what happens is that we create services which are kind of global or available throughout your application, and which are hosted in your root module or in your app module. So interchangeably we can say it either root module or app module, so both are same. So what happens is, say, so if assume this is your app module, so this service will be instantiated in your app module, and it will be available across your application in any of the other lazily loaded modules or components or whatever it may be. Okay, so that is the concept of provided in. So the next we have this export class which is common. So always remember that if you are implementing any Angular utility file, you first have to have a class name like class, and you give it a class name. And class name, as we discussed earlier, it's following Pascal casing, wherein the first letter and the second letter will always be caps, and any other variable name and a function name which you define under this class would be following camel casing, wherein the first letter would be small and the next word letter would be capital. Okay. And as we discussed earlier, depending on the utility, the decorator name changes. So if you remember, if we take a component decorator, you see for component, we define a component by adding this decorator, which is component, and we give it the metadata as required. So similarly, for a utility, like for a service, we have this decorator called injectable. As I said, injectable is what helps to Angular to inject this service into the components, right? Whichever is taking it in. So, and the metadata we provide here is called provided in, and here we say as root. So what that means is the service would be instantiated and created globally, and it can be used as part of any components and lazily loaded modules over here. So that is the concept over here, right? So now that we have created this utility service, how can we use it in our application? Okay. So what I'll do is for time being, I'll just create one simple variable over here. So maybe just call it counter, and I will instantiate it to initialize it to 0, and similarly name, I will just give it the name of ABC. Okay, for the time being, let you guys help to visualize if we are able to use this service. So next what I will do is I'll get into my app component.ts. Okay, so now the first question is, how do I inject or take in this component in my app component, right? So very simple method to do that is, inside your constructor argument, right, you have to first declare this. So what we have to do is use private and give this instance of service a name. So you can give it a name like, say, maybe utility and SVC, service for short, and then you call this, you instantiate this service. So you just say utility service, press enter, and automatically what happens is this utility service gets kind of imported for you. So what we have done right now is we have created an instance of this called in the instance of utility service which is running in our application. So now anywhere in your component, you could now refer this utility service, which is a copy of this utility service that is running, and you could access any variable name or assign it a value or execute any function there. So let's try to see if that works. So what I will do here is, so since we have commented out all our old code, so what I will do is I'll just do a very simple thing. So in our ng after view init lifecycle hook, right? So ng after init is, if you remember, this is a lifecycle hook which gets called whenever your DOM is ready. So once your HTML DOM is ready and painted by your component. So painted I mean once the components are like the HTML DOM elements are rendered by your browser, this lifecycle hook is called. So here what I'll do is I'll just do a simple console log, and I'll just do this dot utility service dot name. Okay. And similarly, I will also do another console log, and this time I'll do a for counter. Okay. So this is the first thing I'm doing. Let's start a server again. So I hope by now you would have understood how to start a server. Either use npm start or give ng serve. So that will start the server for you. So since you are also providing this "-o", it will automatically open the browser for you with the application. So we'll just wait for that. Yeah, you can see now that the CLI has completed building the application and it is opening up the browser for us. Okay, so it has opened the browser. We don't see anything on the HTML because we have not added anything. But if you go to the console log, and if you don't know how to go to console log yet, just right click on your browser, click on inspect. It will open this tab for you. It's not necessary that it should always open on the right hand side. It can open anywhere, and you can adjust the position by clicking on this three dot over here, and you can adjust the position. So say if I want it at bottom, I can do it like this. Sorry, if I want it in a new window, I can click on the first one, and if I want it at the bottom, I could click on this. So you can adjust the space of it the way you want. So if we come to the console, you will see that after view unit is called, and now we are getting the value ABC and also the counter value, right? So what happened now is we have created this utility service over here, and inside this app component, now we have accessed a copy of that. Okay, so I'll just comment this out so we don't have any confusion later. So if you just go back and check your console, you'll see that after the constructor and everything is over, you get the value of ABC and 0, right? So now the next part we will do, we also will check if if the same thing also happens with test component and lazy1 and lazy2. So what we need to do is, now that we have this instance of user service running in our application hosted in app module, so what all we need to do is just call this define this utility service in the constructor of each component that you want to call it, and directly start using it. So we'll just give it a name of utility of the type utility service, and once you just use the autocomplete, it will import it over here for you. And just to avoid typing, what I'll do is I'll just copy the same thing and paste it both in lazy1 module and lazy2 component as well. So in lazy1 component, I'll go here and I will paste the same thing. So just ensure that you import this utility service over here, or else it will throw an error. And similarly, just get here, paste it, just delete the last letter. It will prompt you for that name, enter, select it, and automatically that gets imported. Okay, so now what we have done is we have injected this utility service in all the components that we had. And remember that lazy1 and lazy2 are two different modules, so they are not the same app module. They are lazily loaded modules or feature modules, and app module is your core module, right? Okay, so now what we will do is, so if you remember in our previous session, right, we just implemented two buttons which on clicking will kind of route us to lazy1 and lazy2 module, right? So we'll just enable that back. So just to see if that works again, so we'll just click on this. We see that lazy1 is working, and click on this, lazy2 is working, right? So all I've done is I've just defined two buttons. We have given the router link as lazy1. Router link, as I said, it means that if I want to go to a different address in my application, so a view address or route all means the same. So I can define it in my HTML using this router link attribute. and I define the router name like the router name over here, and that's it. So when I click on that, automatically my application will navigate to this. And how this is being set is using this app routing module, right? So in the app routing module, we give this path of lazy1 and lazy2, the same name which we give in HTML. And here we then tell Angular to, whenever I click on this load children basically means that it is a lazily loaded children, like a lazily loaded module. So whenever I click on this, dynamically Angular will make a call to the server to fetch the lazy1 module. And after that, once it is fetched, it will then load this lazy1 module, and from there again in the lazy1 module there will be something called a routing module, and internally it will then decide, okay, if this lazy1 loading module is called, and no, by default I have to load this lazy1 component, right? And that's how your lazy1 component will get rendered on the screen. So yeah, just a quick revision on what we did earlier. So the whole purpose of me doing this is I just wanted to show you guys how these things are working, right? So what I will do is, so since we have kind of instantiated this utility service across all the components, right? So what I will do is I'll just do a quick thing. I will also kind of uncomment this test module over here. So just to ensure that we have all the 4 modules over here, like which is, one is my app component at the background, one is test here, and when I dynamically click lazy one, like module 1 or module 2, it gets dynamically loaded for me, right? So now what we will do is we will now implement this utility, the requirement that we talked earlier, wherein what we said is we want all the 4 components to kind of read this value, name and counter, and we also want all the 4 components to hit that utility service, utility method, which will get me the name and also increment the counter value for me, right? So let's first implement it in the service and then use it in all the components. So to get name is very simple, right? What all I need to do is first I define a function called, say, get name, and all I need to do here is, so say assume I just want to return the string, or say maybe in this case I just want to console log it. Okay, so all I can do is console log. Okay, so what I've done is, anyone, if they call my get name method over here, I'm directly console logging this with the message that this is called at service. So just to differentiate if you are console logging the same thing at the component as well. So just to ensure that we understand this is getting called from service, I've just defined this message. I've given a comma. So comma is just used for concatenating different values. So this is a string, and after that I'm just taking whatever is the current value of name and console logging it. Okay, so either you can do it this way, or the other way is you can just directly return this dot name. Okay, so what will happen in this case is, whatever is the current value of name, that will get returned to the user, and in your component you can then assign this value or console log it, or do whatever you want. So that is the way you can handle it, fine. So this is one way of doing it. The other thing is, we want to increment the counter value, right? For that, what we do is you just define a function called increment counter. And always remember one thing, from your project perspective, always use camel casing, as I said, wherein if you want to have multiple words, so use the first word as small case and the next word as a larger case, so on and so forth. And similarly, when you give a name, always ensure it is logical. What I mean by that is, if you are, say, writing a function which is fetching a name, so give it a logical name, like get name, or write name, or whatever it may be. Don't give it some nonsensical name or temporary name, like temp1 or some name. No, don't give it like that, because one major issue is, any project, there will be scenarios where either you could be new to the team and the project is already running, or you could move out, or you could be replaced by other person, right? So whoever is coming new to the team, just by looking at the function name and method name and the variable name, they should be able to make out on what that particular method or function or variable is doing. So that is why it is important that you also give the name of these functions properly, right? So now in this increment counter, all we need to do is just take the current value of counter and you have to increment it by 1, right? So ESX shortcut to do that is counter plus equals to 1. So this is same as writing this dot counter equals to this dot counter plus 1. Okay, so instead of writing this law using ESX syntax, we can just write the same thing like this. So plus equals to 1 means the same, this dot counter plus 1, and it will assign it back to this dot counter. So that is what this is doing. Okay, so with that being said, And later what we will do is we will also return this dot counter back to the whichever component is calling us. So what we are doing essentially is first we are incrementing the value of counter, saving it, and then we are returning that value back to the whichever component is calling it, right? So now I hope you guys are now clear on what we have done. We have defined two variables like a counter and name. So one is of the type number, one is of the type string. In the get name, what we are doing is we are just returning the whatever is the current name over here to the component. And in the increment counter, what we are doing is we are first getting the current counter value, incrementing it by 1 and returning back the counter value to the whichever component is calling us, right? So just to ensure to see if it is working fine, what I will do is I'll go back to my app component.ts, okay? And over here, so let's kind of define a new button over here. Okay, so I just defined a new function called getName. Since we are not yet defined in the TypeScript, we are getting the error. So not an issue. We'll just go and define it as well. So what I'll do is I defined a function called getName, and all I'm going to do over here is I'm just going to call my utility service getName. So there are two ways to do it. Either you can like define a function over here and give this like then internally call that and get it. That is one way of doing it. Or the other way of doing it is you can directly call this instance of utility service in your HTML and do it. Okay, so there you can handle it either ways. So first let's try to do in this way. So where I've defined a wrapper function, and in this wrapper function I'm kind of like just making a call to this get name. And what we'll do over here is we'll just kind of like just call it, because already this get name we are kind of like doing a console log as well. So I think that should be fine. And since that is returning a value, what I'll do is I'll just do let final name equals to this, and I will just kind of alert through an alert with this final name. So alert is nothing but it will just like pop in an alert box for you in the browser once you click on that. Okay, so let's see if this works first. So I'll go back to the application. You see that I have something called get name. So what I'll do is I'll just click on that. You see that now I'm getting the name ABC. Okay, and you will also see in your console that there is something called this is called at service ABC, right? So which means that when I click on this particular function and this gets invoked, this function is calling this get name and this utilities and this method which I have defined inside my utility service. So if you just click on the control click on this, it will take you to the service file. So here we have just did a console log. This is called at service and printing the current name. So that is what is happening. And what we are doing is we are also returning that name back to the whichever component we are calling. So that is what we have done over here. So we have just assigned whatever value we are getting back from the service to this final name, and we are just throwing an alert with that, right? So I hope you are now clear that how we are fetching the name using this get name method. So similarly what we can do is we can also define a button which could increment the value for us. Okay, so similarly just like you get name, you can also update a name. Okay, so for that all you need to do is, so here what we are doing is we are just calling the name, right? So here instead of that you could define a method something like this, update name. You could take in a new name as argument. New name is nothing but whatever name the user types in, and all you need to do is this dot name equals to new name, right? So when you do that, it automatically kind of sets that name for you, and you see this is throwing a error because it is telling that implicitly it's of type any, but this dot name we have initialized it with the type string. So this is the beauty of TypeScript. So it will ensure that you are not unintentionally throwing in any new type. So just to fix it, all you need to do is just put it of the type string and you are done. Okay, and to check if this is working, all I will do is just like get name, I'll just define one more button over here called set name, and here under get name I'll just pass a value of say maybe XYZ, and here I need to change the name of get to set. Oh, my bad. I didn't define the wrapper function inside the component. So wrapper function is nothing but you just define a local function inside your component, and inside that function you just internally call that service. So I just say this dot utility service dot set name. Okay, we are given it the name of update name. So all you need to do is just change it to update name, and to this we'll pass the value of new name, which is of the type string, and same new name gets passed over here, and that's it. And just to ensure that you're getting that updated name back, all we will do is we will again just call this get name method again. Okay, so just understand the flow. What we have done is inside the set name is first we are updating the value of name, and just to ensure that we are getting that updated name again, we are calling this get name function over here again. So what this will do is it will take the current name and give the alert back to us. Okay, so let's see if that is working now. So what I will do is, if you remember, initially we have set it to ABC, so that's what you're seeing in the console. I'll clear the console. I'll first do get name just to ensure to see we are getting ABC. That is fine. Now I'll do a set name. Now and you'll see that this is now throwing us XYZ, and this will again that get name method is now updating the value of XYZ, which means now my service has updated the value, and the new value of that is XYZ, right? And the same thing also gets updated to other component as well. So just to show you an example, if I go to say maybe like lazy component 2.ts, okay, just to give you an example, and over here I do the same thing. So what I do is I just define a button, and inside the button I just add a click, and I just define a wrapper function over here, say get name, the same thing that we did earlier. So I just say this dot utility dot get name, okay, and here I just define that get name. So just to differentiate between the two components, I'm just giving it the name of get name for lazy2 component. So if I come back and click on this module 2, so I see that a button is created here called get name for lazy2 component. If I click on other modules, you see that this is gone because this is only for lazy2 module, right? So what I will do is I'll do the same thing. First I'll do get name. You see that it is giving me ABC, which is the default name. And always remember that any changes to your services will get wiped out if you refresh the application. Okay. So say for example now I do set name, which is XYZ, and I refresh the application, right? These changes will be lost. So if I do get name, it will throw me ABC and not XYZ. So always it is important that if you are thinking to kind of persist any values of your application, do not use service, rather use the session storage or local storage. So what are they? Maybe will come by the end of this session. But for now, just understand this important concept that whenever you refresh your application, any changes to the state variables or your services which were done will get reset. Not just services, even like your components or any other files. If you have made any changes to the variable names, those will get reset when you refresh the application. Okay. So coming back, what I said is now let's try to see if the whatever updated value is it being picked up by other component as well. So here what I will do is first I will just go to our app component. Okay. So here now I'll just do a set name. So we have now set the value as XYZ. You can see it also in the console. Now I'll go to the lazy2 module. Okay. We see this component over here. Now I'll click on that. You'll see that now again I'm getting the same value XYZ, right? And why is that so is because as I said, this service is instantiated only once but shared across all the modules and components. So any changes you do it from one component will update the service, and the same service will be used like available for the rest of the modules as well. So similarly, even in lazy1, if I create a similar get name, it will also give me the same XYZ, like or whatever is the updated value it may be. So now I hope that you guys are clear on how can we create a service and share it between the components. So just to recap it again fully, to create a service, all we need to do is, if you come just scroll a bit up in your Angular CLI, That is fine. I'll just retap it for you. So we can just kill the Angular CLI. So if you have to create a new Angular service, all you need to do is do ng generate. So there are two ways to do it. Either you can type the entire word generate, or you can also use the shortcut word, which is G. So either of that is fine. So Angular generate or G for short. Then you type service, or again here also you have this option. If you don't want to type the entire name service, you can just type the word S. Even that is fine. Okay. And then you type the name of the file which you want to create, like the service name. So if you directly want to create under the app folder, you just give it directly whatever name you want. So in our case, we did utility, and it created utility.service.ts for us. But in case you want to create a file inside of a service inside a particular module or inside a particular folder, then you have to give that particular folder name. So say for example, I want to create a service for lazy2 module, right, inside a lazy2 module. So what I can do is I can just give lazy2 slash, and I can give it a name. So maybe I'll just give it a name of test. So if I press enter, what happens is this test service will now get created inside this lazy2 uh, folder for me, as you can see over here. But if you click on this test service, right, you will still see that it is showing as provided in root. As I said earlier, by default any services would be instantiated at your app module level. But in case you feel like, no, I don't want this service to be available across my application only for lazy2, you can just very well just remove this root and just put it as lazy2, right? So what will happen is this will only be available for the lazy2 module, and it won't be available for the rest of the application. Okay. So why you see that this is throwing an error that lazy2 is not assignable to the type any root platform any null. So what it means is like you can only give one of these valid values. So which is like either you can give it as root, you can give it as platform, you can give it as any, or you can give it as null. Okay. So for the sake of brevity, we'll again just change it back to root. Okay. And with that being said, we have now like created a service. We also like wrote a few utilities and variables inside it. We try to understand how we can call it, how we can internally update these values and fetch it, and how we can like call the services across any component. So how to call any, like how to instantiate any services from constructor is you just go to the constructor of that particular component, define a private variable, give it some name whatever you want, and just tell it is of the type that service name, right? So once you do that, you get a copy of that service, and then inside your component you are free to play around with that file as you want it. So, okay, so with that we have reached to the end of this session, and in the next session we will continue with the rest of the concepts of services. Thank you.